Two-star.
Good morning, Rob. You also should put damp in front of the two-star.
The damp admiral.
Yeah, the damp admiral. Because
It's damp everywhere.
it is wet out there.
Well, it's good for the groundwater.
It is good for the groundwater. So this bottling plant in Jefferson County can breathe easy right now.
It's another 1.7 million gallons right there. That's good for the day's work. That'll do it. Let's also welcome in co-host Maria Lawrence, an all-star.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Good to have you.
It is warm. Warm. I'm autopiloting today.
I see.
But
What is the word you're looking for exactly? Wet?
Wet.
But
Wet.
It is wet, not warm. But it is warm, but then it's going to not be warm soon.
He's like a weather person here. You want a
Yeah.
key? You want a key wall behind you? You can bring in the clouds.
No.
she's keeping all of our options in front of her. So,
I am indeed. I am indeed.
So she can bounce this way or that way without any problem.
It's been a long couple of days.
You know, Maria,
you've been busy the last few days.
Yeah, I've been busy.
let me just say, when Bill is the more eloquent of my co-hosts, I've got interesting issues that day.
Yeah, it doesn't bode well for the rest of the morning, does it?
Be careful laughing, man. Be careful.
It'll give you a long 2 hours here.
I'll just be quiet. How about that? I'll give it to Bill.
Like you had a choice there anyway, Maria.
Yeah.
That was not fair. Come on, Joe, jump in.
And that is the laughter of one Joseph Joey Torts Ferretti via telephone. Joe, good morning to you.
I love Maria's forecast. Warm and then not so warm.
Yeah. Yeah, I would not make it as a weather person, Joe. I don't think. But you never know. You never know.
Do you remember WYVN TV?
Yes.
Right, from 1991, 2, 3?
Yep.
Right around there. So I was the weekend weatherman 30
No
years
kid.
ago.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. John Gallos was I think he was a meteorologist. But he was the weekday weather guy, and I was hired to do the weekends when they brought in the Saturday and Sunday weather forecasts and needed to give him a day off. And the biggest adjustment that I know nothing about weather other than what you read, but the biggest adjustment I had to make was dealing with the key wall. So when you do the weather, there's a key wall behind you. You don't see anything when you look at it. You have to look at a monitor. And the monitor you're looking at is looking up at you. So when you see the monitor, you're seeing the direct opposite of what you're looking at.
Okay.
Right? So I would be looking at the monitor to see the key wall behind me for the weather maps and such.
And it was reversed.
And it's reversed. So I'm looking forward and I'm saying to myself, the weather on the West Coast coming our way, and I'm looking at the West Coast in the wrong direction. So I'm constantly pointing in the wrong way, saying that California is over here to the east and Martinsburg is over here to the west. And that you'd see me doing this dance on the stage to get, well, no, this way. And finally, the director said to me, look, you're standing in front of a key wall. The west is always going to be to your right. The east is always going to be on the side where you're standing. Like, yeah, that makes sense. From that point
I can
forward,
remember that. Then you're good. You're good. It sort of reminds me of Groundhog Day. Do you remember?
Oh, yes. Bill Murray.
Because he's a weatherman,
Yes.
of course, and there are pieces of that where you can see him just, pointing all over the place and there's nothing behind him. And then there is. So I never saw you as a weatherman, but I bet it was a good time.
I had fun.
Very few did, Maria. I'm sure he had the 5 viewers thoroughly confused.
After
Joe,
all,
you could be cut off for the rest of the morning.
after all the bankruptcy proceedings, I think after 2 years, I finally got most of the pay that I was.
It was
waiting
time.
on. It didn't end pretty. Joe, good morning. Thank you for joining us again.
Oh, glad to be.
There were some interesting decisions with the courts recently, and I know you also wanted to get into, as did I, the Luigi Mangione gun situation, because there's a lot to unwrap there as well. But there are a few Supreme Court situations that we'd like to delve into. And one of those is this Loper-Bright case, because it kind of goes back to Chevron, which we discussed earlier this year. Can you review some of that for us and how it shook out?
Real quickly, just to get people oriented to the topic here, we had discussed the fact that in Loper-Bright versus Raimondo, and that's Gina Raimondo, who is the Commerce Secretary, she was defending the government action here, which was, in essence, under federal regulations, requiring fishermen off the coast, think off the coast of Maine or someplace out there fishing, they have to have federal monitors with them to make sure that they are adhering to federal regulations in terms of how they're fishing, how much they're fishing, and things of that nature. And under the federal regulations, the government was requiring those fishermen to pay for those federal monitors who were on their boats. And the fishermen finally got tired of it, saying, look, this is adding up to sometimes $500, $600, $700 a day. And it's really becoming a problem in terms of making a profit. So they challenged this regulation, saying that the federal government overstepped its authority. And where have we heard that before, right? We had an attorney general here in West Virginia who has in part made his career on bringing cases claiming that the federal government is overstepping its authority. Well, finally, the Supreme Court that we have constituted today took a look at this and said, okay, no longer are we going to follow the Chevron doctrine, which dates back to the 1980s and the Reagan administration. And what the doctrine basically stands for is the proposition that in federal regulation, Congress could not think and do everything. So we've left it to these federal agencies in some respects to do rulemaking and to enforce regulations as they see fit. This case, now, the ruling is that the courts should still have a say in terms of how these regulations are interpreted. As Justice Roberts says, this goes back to Marbury versus Madison. The courts have the ability to interpret law. So no longer will we give deference to the federal agencies. The courts will also have a say in how these regulations are interpreted. So flash forward now to a new administration coming in and a President Trump who wants to put his own people into many of these federal agencies to regulate, and in some cases not regulate. The theory goes that because no longer do we have to pay deference to what these federal agencies want to do, that the Trump administration will actually be thwarted in some of its efforts to reform these agencies, reform the regulations, because now we're going to have perhaps liberal or progressive-leaning attorney generals across the country running to the courts and saying, hey, guess what? We don't have to listen to these federal agencies any longer. The courts can interpret these rules and regulations. So in some respects, it's been turned on its head in terms of the conservative effort to overturn Chevron. It may actually become an impediment to the Trump administration trying to instill a lot of the changes it wants in federal regulation. So we're going to have to watch play out in the future, but it's going to be interesting to see now the new cases that are going to be filed in the court systems. They're not going to be the same as the cases that were filed by Patrick Morrisey and other attorney generals across the country. They're going to be different kinds of cases from a different perspective.
So, Joe, does this potentially lead to 25 states having one law and 25 states having a different interpretation of the same law?
Well, it could be. And you're seeing that now already. Look at the state Medicaid situation. Across the country, different states have adopted Medicaid expansion. Some states are looking at trying to institute some kind of work requirements with Medicaid. And whether or not the federal agencies and Medicaid, this is going to be Health and Human Services, whether they're going to be able to regulate in these areas now and not enjoy the deference they used to have could be a matter for the courts. So I think you're going to see some states trying to carve out exceptions and go their own way on some of these federal regulations.
Yeah, some of the regulations, especially the Luper Wright case, was started because of overfishing, and we were running out of our fishery stock, and so that was put in the case. And Department of Commerce / NOAA has the responsibility of monitoring the fishermen. There may have been a more effective way or more less expensive way of doing it, but what scares me about this, Joe, is that if Congress is proving itself not capable of regulated, not capable of establishing governing laws. We've been in a kind of a stagmire for the last couple so years. If the agencies cannot do it, who's going to do it? Or will we have any control at all in overfishing or a host of other environmental considerations?
Yeah, a very good point, Bill. And that's some of the fears that are coming out of the folks who will be involved in the Trump administration, is that if Congress has left it to some of these agencies to regulate, and surely they have, because Congress cannot anticipate all the issues that are going to come up in the regulatory scheme, you can't count on a closely divided Congress and a Senate with a filibuster rule to pass a bunch of laws to achieve the deregulation and, in some cases, the reformation of some of these federal agencies. The Trump administration is not going to be able to play that card very well because of really the tie-ups in Congress.
Well, and wouldn't there be something, if what you believe, if what you read is true, just sort of the, the trimming of a lot of these agencies, who's going to be there to administer all of this? I mean, is that going to have any impact, do you think, Joe?
Oh, I think so. Look, the whole purpose behind the Chevron doctrine and deference to these federal agencies is we know they're stocked with experts. Just look at the FDA, an agency that Rob's somewhat familiar with. It's full of chemists and pharmacists and those people who have an expertise in the area that Congress and the courts will never have. And so we have, for decades, gone to the federal agencies for that kind of guidance and expertise. Now, in some cases, have they overstepped? Have they? Certainly. I think requiring these fishermen to pay for the monitoring that the government imposes on them was a bit too much. And it was affecting some of their ability to make a profit and hire people. So, there's clearly examples of overstepping, too. There's just a happy medium somewhere that has to be struck. And you hope that going forward, the Trump administration will realize that a total dismantling of some of these federal agencies is probably not a workable solution.
And by the way, before we move on to the next subject, I want to credit Bill for, I think, the invention of a great word, stagmire, which is a combination of stagnant and quagmire. I think you may have accidentally done that, but I think it's actually a brilliant word. That was perfect.
Joe, is that a backhanded compliment?
No, that was genuine. Stagmire is perfect.
I kind of like it too.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to say anything, though, so.
I did not realize.
That's what I'm here for, Bill.
No, Bill, that wasn't back. No assault.
Yeah, Stagmire is perfect. Hey, let's move on to.
Thanks, Rob. Well, once again, you've made my day.
I sincerely like the word.
You keep going, Bill. You keep going, because I'm going to just sit today.
Remember, Maria set the bar low this morning.
I did. Very low, very low.
Hawaii gun case. This is a fascinating case to me, Joe, as I read about this when the Supreme Court decided, I guess, to not hear this case. That's the gist of how this turned out, Joe?
Yeah, I guess the importance of this case is that the Supreme Court refused to take it up. But it involved a young man who was hiking in the wilds of Hawaii, and he was carrying a gun. Now, his gun was not licensed, and Hawaii has fairly strict licensing laws. So he challenged his citation that he received, saying it was an infringement on his Second Amendment rights. And he, of course, relied upon the 2022 decision, that New York case involving licensing issues that existed in that state. And interestingly, the Supreme Court did not take his case up. Now, arguably, it was for procedural grounds, but the Hawaii Supreme Court clearly clapped back at the U.S. Supreme Court and said, look, this New York decision from 2022, which liberalized that state's licensing requirements for gun carrying and gun ownership, was really an attempt at, quote, time traveling back to 1791 and 1868 as a means to control and regulate modern society. So they looked at the Supreme Court's decision in 2022 as pure folly. and were critical of it and said that this man's citation is going to stand and he's going to have to pay it. And as a result of this decision, he's not going to get any relief at the U.S. Supreme Court on Second Amendment grounds. Now, that's not the end of the licensing debate in this country. There's plenty of states who still license and require licensing of guns, Maryland being one of them, that have pretty strict laws. So this is going to continue to be a battle, and on occasion we're going to have these cases bubble their way up through the federal courts. And eventually I think there's going to be another licensing case before the U.S. Supreme Court where we'll get further clarification on the limits that states have in terms of licensing.
Did they say the reason why they decided to not hear this case, Joe?
Well, Justice Thomas referred to some procedural issues regarding, what was the matter ripe for the U.S. Supreme Court to take on. And he gets into some real complicated issues about ripeness and whether the courts below adequately address some of the state laws that were still at issue here. So, it's quite possible this case could come back around with this same individual. His name's Christopher Wilson. This case could come back around if there's further development in the state courts below.
So more procedural than anything else, because
Yes.
I thought there were some suits within the last few years that had made the District of Columbia and the state of Maryland loosen up some of their restrictions on gun licensure.
Yeah, that 2022 decision did have an impact on many states. Now, the New York licensing case, the licensing laws in New York were very strict. In fact, licenses were rarely being granted in many jurisdictions in the state of New York. And I believe the Supreme Court felt compelled on Second Amendment grounds to take a look at that situation. But you're correct. Other states then went back and changed their state licensing laws somewhat to allow a little bit more of a liberal approach in terms of granting licenses.
So let's stay on guns for a second and move on to Luigi Mangione and a printed gun, which was used, allegedly, in the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO.
Yeah, this was, when you say printed gun, it's often referred to as a ghost gun. And there's really two different kinds of ghost guns. There's the ones that can, the components can actually be made on a 3D printer. So you can make these at home if you have a 3D printer. Or a ghost gun is also a gun where you can buy the components, let's say online or from some gun components dealer, and then assemble the gun yourself so that it becomes an operable firearm. In both instances, the concern, Rob, is that these guns don't carry serial numbers, and there's really not a good way to trace the fact that these guns are owned and possessed by people, in some cases, who really shouldn't have guns. Maybe they have a felony record or prior gun violation. This is a way to circumvent some of those prohibitions. So the Biden administration came forward and said, we want to start regulating these kinds of guns. And in the case here not long ago, Garland versus Vanderstock, where the question was, did the ATF exceed its authority in regarding weapons parts manufacturers to affix serial numbers and to have some kind of traceable policy program in place that these parts can be traced. The U.S. Supreme Court said, well, this case is pending, but the Supreme Court is very much leaning towards allowing the ATF to regulate in this area because the statistics are showing guns are showing up at crime scenes. They're becoming a real problem, and especially in a lot of our urban areas. And so federal agencies, law enforcement agencies, state police from various states are all saying we need the ability to also trace the components of guns so that we know that if somebody is actually assembling a firearm, that we would have ability to understand where those components came from and how this individual came to possess that gun.
And go ahead, Marie.
I was just going to say, this guy was pretty smart, though. He from all indications, he found a way and was a very smart individual. So
Was but wasn't. Smart enough to be the valedictorian at Gilman, get an Ivy League education, advanced degree.
Go through the McDonald's drive-through.
But not smart enough to ditch the gun and the fake ID.
Yeah,
that part doesn't make any sense to me.
And then be identified by a minimum wage worker, which is pretty phenomenal when you think of how that all.
But could I ask, going back to Joe's point, Joe, how would ATF regulate a gun that was developed with a
Put
3D,
together at
3D
home.
printer, or where you assemble a dozen parts from a dozen different companies? To me, that'd be a Herculean. Is that a good word, Rob?
You actually pulled that one off sweet.
A Herculean task.
Yeah,
And a Stagmeyer.
Yeah, well, I think the way that ATF typically regulates in this area is to make it illegal to possess a gun that does not have a serial number. It's like, we have laws right now. If you try to file off a serial number of a gun, that's a federal offense. And so to require that kind of markings on the gun is going to be a separate offense that you could be charged with. So if you are the kind of individual who, as a hobby, like to manufacture guns from components or with the use of a 3D printer, you're going to have to know that the law is going to require you to register that gun and to go through ATF so that maybe some sort of marking or serial number is affixed to the gun to comply with the law.
Joe, we have 2 minutes left to get to Tennessee, so this will have to be a quick summary.
Yeah, fascinating case, Rob, and perhaps it might even come up on Friday. The gender-affirming care ban that exists in Tennessee was recently argued before the Supreme Court. Observers and people who have listened to the argument, and I listened to parts of it, clearly there's a conservative bloc of justices, probably 6 in number, who are going to vote to uphold the Tennessee ban on gender-affirming care. Interestingly, the federal government was arguing on the side of equal protection and discrimination law and the effects this ban would have on people in Tennessee. And they brought up the fact that in West Virginia, the argument was actually made that West Virginia did this correctly by, of course, banning gender-affirming care, but allowing for exceptions if there are medical reasons for an individual to require, say, puberty blockers or hormone therapy. That Senator Takubo was instrumental in West Virginia in getting that exception included in the West Virginia law. It was actually used as an example of why the Tennessee law should be stricken because it did not include that exception.
Joe, good quick summary on that, and I thank you for your review of all these situations this morning in a very understandable and concise manner. Well done, sir.
Well, there's always something going on in the courts, Rob.
It was just nice we didn't get bogged down in a Stagmeyer this morning, yes.
Don't get stuck in your Stagmeyer, Joe.
And take on your Herculean tests. Look at it, he pulled that one off.
Come on, Joe. We need you in studio.
Amen. Especially today.
Have a good day, Joe.
Here.
Okay, Joe.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good day.